Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We take your articles, research notes, and boil them down, to those crucial nuggets and insights. Today, we're diving into something that might shift how you see things. Is the Russia-Ukraine conflict a 2-year war, or is it actually, well, closer to a 10-year one? Our mission is to cut through the noise, give you a clearer picture of the long, intertwined history behind today's conflict, pulling out the key stuff from the sources you shared.
And that timeline question, it's absolutely vital. What we're seeing now, the intensity, the history, it's really the result of more than 1,000 years of shared history, sometimes cooperative, often contentious, as our sources show really clearly. This isn't just about the last couple of years.
Okay, so where do we even start unpacking this incredibly long history? What's the origin?
You have to go way back, like all the way back to the 9th century. Kiev on Rus. It was the first East Slavic state, founded in Kiev by Viking traders, warriors actually. Think of it as the shared cradle for both modern Ukraine and Russia. It really thrived under people like Prince Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise, that's 10th, 11th centuries. And a huge moment really was Vladimir adopting Eastern Orthodox Christianity in 988. That became the main religion in both places.
Wow, a shared cradle. It's kind of amazing. But like you said, common start doesn't mean a common path, right? When did Ukraine start trying to, forge its own identity?
Exactly. That's a key point.
Yeah.
Jump forward to the mid-17th century. You see this really clear push for a distinct Ukrainian identity. The Cossack leader, Bohdan Khmelnytsky, he led this big effort for an independent Ukraine. He signed the Pereyaslav Agreement in 1654 with the Russian Tsar. It basically put an autonomous Ukraine under Russian rule, but the idea was to get military help against Poland. And our sources, like one from NPR, they really highlight this, saying Russia and Ukraine have never entirely untangled that history. It just keeps looping back.
Never entirely untangled. That really sets the stage for Russia's claims over Ukraine, doesn't it? How did that control play out over time?
Well, yeah. Building on that 17th century deal, Russia basically controlled large parts, sometimes all, of Ukraine for about 350 years. Imperial Russia, for instance, took over most of western Ukraine from Poland, got the Crimean Peninsula from the Tatars. This was by the late 1700s. The Tsars even called it Little Russia, which is pretty revealing. And you hear echoes today, right? President Putin keeps talking about Ukraine being part of the Russian world. President Zelensky, of course, completely rejects that. Putin's goal, it seems from the sources, is maybe recreating a kind of Russian empire, directly or indirectly. And it's not just history. Ukraine's land, so fertile, the breadbasket of Europe. That's always been a huge economic prize for Russia, too.
It's fascinating how these old threads directly connect to today's geopolitics. But what about the culture? Did they try to merge identities?
Oh, absolutely. The ties were deep. Did you know the very first Russian history textbook was written in Kiev back in the 1670s? It shows that initial common ground. And historian Serhiy Plunky points out, Russians and Ukrainians historically shared a lot about social structures, education, how cities grew mostly because of centuries under Russian rule. But despite all that, when Putin says Ukrainians are just Russians, well, the sources say that's widely seen as baseless, especially by Ukrainians themselves, obviously.
So across these different eras, how did Russia try to cement that control, and what was the Ukrainian response?
They systematically pushed Russification. It meant cracking down hard on Ukrainian culture, sometimes limiting the language, sometimes banning it outright, forcing conversions to Russian Orthodoxy, getting rid of local officials, killing or exiling intellectuals. It was a really deliberate attempt to stamp out a separate Ukrainian identity. And it got much, much worse during the Soviet period. Confiscating farmland, forced collectivization, that led straight to Stalin's engineered famine, the Holodomor in the 20s and 30s. Millions died. Then they moved huge numbers of ethnic Russians into eastern Ukraine and Crimea, especially after deporting the native Tatars. Hundreds of thousands. Even after the Soviet Union fell, Russia kept its influence, cheap oil and gas, backing pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine.
That's such a brutal history of trying to erase a people. Given all that, when did Ukraine actually manage to break free and become fully independent in the modern era?
Well, for a long time, Ukrainian activists mostly wanted autonomy, within a larger empire, not necessarily full independence straight away. It was really the 20th century when the dream of a truly sovereign nation took hold. Our sources talk about 5 attempts to declare independence in the 20th century. The 5th one, in 1991, finally stuck. And that was huge. December 1991, they held a referendum. Over 92% voted for independence. And what's really striking, even in Crimea, which was very Russo-centric, a slight majority voted yes for independence. That feeling was kind of captured by Leonid Kuchma's book title, Ukraine is Not Russia, a real symbol of that moment.
Okay, so long history of control, resistance, then finally independence in 91. But obviously the story didn't end there. What were the big flashpoints this century that really led us to the current conflict?
Right. The first really big one was the Orange Revolution in 2004. It kicked off after claims of massive vote rigging in the presidential election. The opposition guy, Viktor Yushchenko, was actually poisoned. He blamed Russia later. Huge peaceful protests followed, forced a rerun election, and Yushchenko won. But Russia saw these color revolutions everywhere as, like the US and Europe, trying to undermine them. Then, fast forward to 2013-2014, the Euromaidan, or Revolution of Dignity. Ukraine's parliament had approved this big EU association agreement moving closer to Europe. But Russia put on massive pressured trade embargoes, things like that, and President Yanukovych suddenly backed out of signing it. That sparked enormous protests. People were furious about Russian interference, about corruption. It turned violent. Over 100 protesters were killed by snipers. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and the parliament voted him out.
And it was right then, right after Yanukovych left, that things really started to escalate on the ground, wasn't it? That's where the timeline gets critical.
Exactly. Almost immediately after Yanukovych fled, these pro-Russian protests popped up in southeastern Ukraine. Russia initially said, not us, but later admitted they were involved. This wasn't just some local reaction. It was the real start, the beginning of the current war.
Which brings us right back to that key question we started with. When did this war really begin? Because most people think February 2022. But the sources you've shared, they paint a totally different picture, don't they? Walk us through that.
This is maybe the most crucial takeaway from this whole deep dive. The sources are crystal clear on this. The Russo-Ukrainian War did not start in February 2022. It absolutely began in February 2014. First, with Russia's armed takeover and illegal annexation of Crimea. Then, quickly followed by their covert intervention in Donbass, starting in April 2014. Ukraine's own parliament officially marked February 20th, 2014 as the start date. And get this, that same date is literally engraved on Russia's own medal for the Crimea campaign, the Crimea annexation. There's a textbook example of hybrid warfare. You had Russian soldiers with no insignia, the famous polite people, or little green men, occupying key sites from February 27, 2014. Putin later admitted, yeah, those were our special forces, but it wasn't just soldiers. They also used unarmed irregulars with civilian machinery to break down gates before the troops went in. And what's really important to understand, polls before the annexation didn't show huge support in Crimea for joining Russia, not even among ethnic Russians. The speed, the coordination, it just screams pre-planning. Sources say Russia moved modern military gear to its Sevastopol base, maybe as early as 2010, formed new brigades there in 2012. This wasn't spontaneous.
Wow, okay, that completely reframes the narrative. So Crimea was planned, a military move, but what about Donbass? Was that a genuine local uprising? Or was Russia behind that too?
The sources are really firm here. Russia instigated the war in Donbass. It wasn't just a local thing bubbling up. They actively manipulated it. They even brought Russian citizens across the border from Rostov to pose as protesters. The evidence was so strong that the European Court of Human Rights ruled Russia had effective control over the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics right from 2014. They pointed to Russian military personnel being there from April 2014 and large troop deployments from August 2014. And this is where Russia's hybrid approach was really visible. It was this mix, right? Disinformation, irregular fighters, sort of a mix of Russian and Ukrainian paramilitaries, Cossacks, extremists, mercenaries, plus regular Russian troops, and conventional military backup. The whole point was to stir up conflict, keep it going, maintain this plausible deniability while pushing their own agenda.
So years of this simmering hybrid war, what finally triggered the full-scale invasion in 2022? What was the catalyst?
Well, leading up to it, Russia started this huge military buildup near Ukraine's borders. That began around March 2021. All the while, they kept saying, nope, no invasion planned. Even as U.S. intelligence was releasing incredibly accurate predictions about what was coming, like down to specific targets. Then February 24th, 2022, Putin announces the special military operation, his stated reasons, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. He made these pretty wild claims, like Russophobia is a first step towards genocide, or that Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, even said it was created by Vladimir Lenin. Our sources stress these justifications were just widely rejected internationally as completely baseless excuses.
And the invasion itself, what did that look like?
Minutes after Putin spoke, missiles and airstrikes hit all across Ukraine, Kyiv included. Then came a massive ground invasion from multiple directions north towards Kyiv, south from Crimea, east towards Kharkiv. But Ukrainian resistance was incredibly fierce, much stronger than Russia expected. They actually pushed Russian forces back from Kyiv by April. After that, Russia shifted focus, concentrating on the south and east. Mariupol eventually fell after this horrific, long siege.
It's really stark connecting those events. Okay, let's widen the view again. What are the bigger consequences of this conflict now clearly a decade long? What do the sources tell us about the global impact?
The human cost is just immense. The UN called it the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Millions displaced. Internationally, there's been almost universal condemnation. The UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, they've called it a war of aggression. This led to massive sanctions against Russia and huge amounts of aid, both humanitarian and military, going to Ukraine, billions from the U.S. alone. And the sources detail extensive war crimes and human rights abuses, starting way back in 2014. Things like deliberate attacks on civilians, the massacre in Bucha, torture, rape, forced deportations even of children to Russia, attacks on hospitals too. Now, the UN Human Rights Office has documented severe violations by Russia in occupied areas, forced Russification, indoctrinating kids, suppressing Ukrainian culture. But importantly, the sources also note accusations against Ukrainian forces regarding mistreatment of detainees. We have to acknowledge that for a balanced picture.
Beyond the immediate horror, what about the economics, the geopolitics? Are there deeper motivations driving this long conflict?
Absolutely. It's not just the breadbasket thing. Ukraine has incredibly valuable natural resources, lithium, rare earth elements, estimated worth over $11.5 trillion. Controlling those, the sources suggest, could give Russia a near monopoly on some critical materials that could potentially help offset the economic hit they've taken from the war and sanctions. And then there's the whole energy politics angle. The Nord Stream pipelines. Ukraine was always a major transit route for Russian gas to Europe, earning significant fees. Russia building pipelines like Nord Stream to bypass Ukraine was seen by many as a way to reduce Ukraine's leverage, basically using gas as a geopolitical weapon. And the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2 back in September 2022 just highlighted how volatile that whole energy game is. And we see the evolution of hybrid warfare too. It's not just boots on the ground or disinformation. We've seen major cyber attacks hitting Ukraine's power grid, ransomware attacks, plus the relentless information war, fake news, false flag operations, and Russia's own strict domestic laws against fake news to control their narrative.
And the impact on NATO. It seems like Russia's actions kind of backfired there, didn't they?
Totally. The irony is thick, isn't it? Russia's aggression since 2014 has pushed Ukraine much closer to the West and NATO, the very thing Putin said he wanted to stop. And look at Finland. Historically neutral, now in NATO. It literally doubled the length of NATO's border with Russia overnight. Putin fundamentally believes, according to our sources, that a truly independent, democratic, pro-Western Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia itself. That seems to be driving these extreme actions and public opinion. It's a stark divide. Ukrainians overwhelmingly reject being a one people with Russians. They strongly oppose the war. In Russia, support for the war is described as broad but not deep. A lot of people just refuse to answer polls, It's hard to get a real read when speaking out carries such huge risks.
We have covered so much ground, from ancient Kievan Rus right up to the complex conflict happening now. It's just so clear that understanding this requires looking much, much deeper than the daily headlines.
And to really boil it down, this is a conflict with incredibly deep historical roots, control, resistance, back and forth. The absolute key point from our sources, the current war started in 2014. Crimea, Donbass. Not 2022. That reframes everything. Russia's aggression is complex, military hybrid tactics, economic motives all intertwined, and the human cost, the global fallout. It just highlights why understanding this long history, not just the latest phase, is so critical.
So what does this mean for you listening? It means being truly informed isn't just knowing what's happening now. It's understanding the why and the how it all began. Hopefully this deep dive gives you that crucial context, helps you see past the immediate news cycle to the centuries-long dynamics underneath. And here's a final thought to leave you with. Given these deep roots, Russia's long-term goals as laid out in these sources, is a lasting peace actually possible here? Or are we just watching another chapter in this centuries-long fight for Ukraine to determine its own future? What stands out most to you about this incredibly complex history?